Hey, my daddy always told me that if you wanted to get the straight information, the facts, you always go to the source. You don't deal around with these second, third party avenues. And we're really proud to welcome today Joe Bacarella. He is the manager of technical assistance for Tenneco. You know Tenneco, that's Monroe, Walker, other brands that we use every day in the shop. More specifically, he takes care of the technical assistance call centers located in the U.S., Canada, and Mexico for all the Tenneco brands, including the line of Walker emissions products. And since that's the topic today, dealing with those catalytic efficiency below threshold codes, who better to go to than Joe? Joe, thanks so much for taking the time to hang out with me today.
Thanks for inviting us, Pete.
You know, we got techs who get those dreaded 420, 430 codes, catalytic efficiency below threshold, very easy to just go blame the catalytic converter right away, but oftentimes that's not the case, is it?
Yeah, that's true. Converter efficiency, as the name implies, there's a number of things that can affect the efficiency of the converter, and I like to say, it's very similar to an engine. Engine efficiency is really based a lot on what's going into it, the air-fuel ratio and other factors, and the converter's the same way. It really relies on the feed gases coming from the cylinder to improve its efficiency. If the feed gases are balanced correctly, then the converter can work efficiently. So what we've done is we've put together 5 quick steps that the professional technician can use each time they run into these codes to help them ensure that they've corrected the issue right the first time.
Yeah, and of course now maybe it is the converter. I mean, they do get old, they do wear out, but sometimes they die a premature death and set these codes. So it's vitally important to make sure that if it is the cat, you know what killed that cat. So we really have a two-edged sword dealing with these 420, 430 codes. I tell you what, Joe, I know you've got a lot of information that are going to help technicians solve those issues, so you go to it and I'll just listen.
Okay, so what I was planning on doing is covering the 5 steps quickly first, and then we can go into more detail on each one of them because there is certainly a lot of thought behind these 5 steps, and we'll go into that thought process and exactly what the professional technician should be looking for with each step. So the 5 steps are simply, the first step number 1 is to correct all other PCM codes first. As all of us are aware, the codes in the PCM are really all emission-related codes, so they are mandated for emissions, and so if you have another code, it's definitely going to affect emissions, and so we need to make sure if there's any other codes associated with the P420 and P430 that we resolve those issues first, and then we have a good fighting chance at resolving the emissions issue. So step number 1 is to correct all other PCM codes. Step number 2 is to inspect for and correct any exhaust leaks. And now this is really critical because, as I mentioned before, the converter is relying on the feed gases from the engine. If those feed gases are being diluted, there's going to be an issue. So step number 2, inspect and correct any exhaust leaks. Step number 3 is to check for fuel control, and we'll get into more detail on this later, but fuel control is basically making sure that you have the proper air-fuel ratio of 14.7 to 1, and keep in mind as a professional technician, whatever goes into the cylinder is what's coming out of the cylinder, whatever the balance is between air and fuel. Going into that cylinder, that's what's coming out. You're not adding fuel in the cylinder, you're not adding air in the cylinder. So that perfect balance of air to fuel that's going into the cylinder is what the converter is going to see. So we need to make sure that our fuel control is working properly. So that's step number 3. Step number 4 is to check for causes of converter contamination. So as you mentioned, if the converter goes bad, most likely something killed the converter. So we need to identify what killed the converter, if it was contamination, and we have to correct that issue before we install the new converter. Of course, the new converter will fail very quickly. Moving on to step number 5. Step number 5 is simply making sure you have the correct converter for the application. Now, it sounds pretty simple at first, but it's getting more and more specific on modern vehicles. So we have vehicles that are California emission certified. We have vehicles that are 49 state certified, and that can affect which converter is really correct. And then we also have engine family number, which is really key on a lot of modern vehicles. We need to know what the EFN number is, and we can get that information simply off the emissions information tag in the engine compartment. So those are the 5 steps, and we can go into more detail now unless you had any questions, Pete.
Well, no, so one thing that caught my eye, of course, was step number 2, the exhaust leaks. And sometimes they're not so obvious. And I'm sure that you have some tricks that you're going to share with us when we get to that point, but the one that comes immediately to my mind is when you're dealing with the inline 4s, they have all that heat shield around the exhaust manifold, that could be hiding, evidence of an exhaust leak. But you need to make sure that there's none present, as you pointed out. The last part, too, we mentioned, too, about the catalytic converters. I know that, for example, California, it's got to have that stamp, right, to be installed. And
Yep.
It's my understanding that the state of New York is got that in the works, where it has to be regulated. So in other words, message, guys, that I want to get across to you, universal means it universally works on nothing. You've got to use the right application, for the car.
Yeah, that's true. And our universal converters simply mean that they're not direct fit, that you're going to weld those in. And we have specific universal converters that fit specific applications listed in our catalog. It's no longer one size fits all type of thing, or
Right.
if it fits, it'll work. You need to make sure you're using the correct converter for the application. So we'll get into that as we talk about step number 5 in more detail.
Okay. So
Okay.
Go ahead. Step number 1 was?
Step number 1 is to correct all other PCM codes first. So that's pretty self-explanatory. Of course, if you have any other code, if you have an O2 sensor code, or really any code, you need to identify what's causing that code and resolve that. And usually that's the easy part. Most other codes are pretty straightforward, where P420 and P430 really can cover a variety of issues. So check for any other codes and make sure those are resolved before you move on. So that's pretty straightforward, which brings us to step number 2, inspect and correct any exhaust leaks. Now, as I mentioned before, the converter is relying on feed gases from the engine. And if an engine requires that perfect fuel mixture of 14.7 to 1 to operate efficiently, the converter is even more reliant on that. And what I mean by that is an engine can operate in a pretty wide ratio of air-fuel ratios, but a converter can't. We'll talk more about that in the next step. But so to ensure you have no dilution from outside air, we need to check and inspect for any exhaust leaks. So what's happening, most technicians think of the exhaust as being under pressure all the time or constant flow out, but that's not the case. Anytime the throttle is partially closed, you actually have oscillating pulses in the exhaust, which are vacuum pulses and pressure pulses. So when the throttle is closed and the piston is going down, and it can't draw enough air in to the intake because the throttle is mostly closed, it actually pulls quite a bit of exhaust gases back into the cylinder. So that's creating a vacuum pulse in the exhaust, which can actually pull outside air into the exhaust stream. Now, normally the exhaust gases are composed of about less than 0.5% of oxygen. And the air we're breathing is 21% oxygen. So if you have even a small pinhole leak or crack, it's going to pull 21% oxygen into the exhaust stream, which will dilute the mixture and can result in a P420 code. And the reason why that's really important, there's two reasons, is first of all, the P420 code is based off of readings from the rear O2 sensor. So the job of the converter is to store and release oxygen. If there's too much oxygen in the exhaust stream, some of that oxygen is going to get past the converter, go to the rear O2 sensor, and it's going to sense that the converter isn't storing oxygen or enough oxygen, and it's going to flag that P420 code. So an exhaust leak pulling in oxygen from the outside air can definitely trigger a P420 code, P430 code, because the converter simply isn't large enough to handle all the extra oxygen that's coming in through that exhaust leak. So we've got a couple of tips for checking for exhaust leaks. And, the most common would be just a visual inspection after the exhaust is installed. You're looking for exhaust leaks. But a better way to inspect for exhaust leaks would be to use your smoke machine to basically smoke the exhaust and look for any exhaust leaks. Anything small, as I mentioned before, even a pinhole leak around an O2 sensor can really play havoc on fuel control and cause issues with the converter. Any exhaust leaks around the exhaust manifolds really need to be addressed also. Now, an even better method, or I would say more specific method for checking for exhaust leaks is something I like to recommend. And what some of the guys, what I've seen done in the field is to simply use a shop vac on reverse, on blow mode. So you hook up your shop vac in blow mode, you hook it up to the intake of the vehicle, and you blow pressurized air into the intake, and then you seal the exhaust outlet, with the engine off, of course, you're going to seal the outlet. And what works nice to seal the outlet of the exhaust is just use a large socket, clamp it in place with some with pliers or vice grips, and maybe wrap a rag around it, and you can seal the exhaust. And so you're forcing pressurized air through the intake, through the, of course, open intake and exhaust valves on one of the cylinders, kind of pressurize the exhaust, and then you would make a solution of soapy water and spray it on all the joints and all the welds, and you're looking for those welds to bubble up. Wherever you see bubbles indicates you have a leak. So that's a great method for checking for small pinhole leaks. I've seen it done in the field. It works really well, and you can use that method with both a cold exhaust and also a warm exhaust. You can heat up the engine and then hook everything up and do it, because exhaust is going to expand and contract, and so leaks are going to open up and close with temperature. So it's not a bad idea to check it both ways.
Sure. And let me interject here, Joe. I would tend to think that you could have a pinhole leak, and we're looking for leaks upstream of that rear sensor, right? Primarily.
Well, really, I would say anything within 1.5 feet of the rear of the converter is going to be an issue, because remember, we have vacuum pulses when that piston is going down and the throttle is mostly closed. Like when you're cruising, your throttle is mostly closed.
Right.
And so it's going to draw that exhaust back up into the engine. So yeah, even an exhaust leak within 1.5 feet of the rear of the converter can cause a problem.
Yeah, and it may not necessarily impact fuel trims or by diluting any signals near the front. You can still have an issue and not necessarily see that, as an issue with fuel trim, or even certainly not a hard set code, right?
Yeah, that's true. So the PCM only knows, what the O2 sensors, what information the O2 sensors are feeding it. So it's assuming the exhaust is tight. So if you have an exhaust leak, it's really feeding incorrect data to the O2 sensor, and your fuel control is going to be off. So the front O2 sensor does fuel control, and if that's diluted with outside air, oxygen, it's going to think the engine is really running leaner than it is, and it's going to add more fuel, which is going to raise emissions and cause the converter to work harder, which could lead to a P420, 430 code. So it's really critical. Step number 2, I can't emphasize how critical it is to make sure the exhaust is tight, and not just for the converter, but also for good efficiency of the engine.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, so moving on to step number 3, which really ties into step number 2, I want to check for good fuel control. And so what I like to say is lambda. Technicians are familiar with the term lambda, but I'm going to elaborate on it. And basically, the perfect air-fuel mixture for gasoline, as we all know, theoretically is 14.7 parts of air for every 1 part of fuel. So that's in theory. Lambda is a way of measuring that more precisely. Lambda is a more precise way of measuring fuel control in the vehicle. So I'd like to talk about that because that's critical to come up that perfect lambda of 1 for it to operate efficiently. An engine can operate under a really wide range of air-fuel ratios. You can have air-fuel ratios all the way down to 12, as rich as 12 to 1. And the engine can still operate, and it may build a lot of power at that ratio. And you can have air-fuel ratios as lean as 17 or 18 to 1 until you start getting misfires. So an engine could be running at 13.8 to 1, and it may seem like it's running fine and have plenty of power and drivability could be perfect, but your emissions are going to be high because that perfect balance of air to fuel is off. So we need to make sure we have that perfect balance. Now, the engine can operate under a wide range of conditions, and it would stall out if you get outside of that range, right? But the converter works much in the same manner, but under tighter parameters. The engine can work under a wide range because it has the advantage of compression and of spark to help basically convert the air and fuel into CO2 and water. The converter is doing the same thing. It's taking any unburnt fuel, hydrocarbons, or CO, partially burnt fuel, and it's converting the NOx, of course. It's taking those unwanted gases and it's converting them into CO2 and water, just as the engine does. But it doesn't have the advantage of compression. It doesn't have the advantage of spark. All it really has is heat and that perfect balance of air to fuel to work with. So the air-fuel ratio must be much tighter for the converter to work. In fact, any air-fuel ratio outside the range of about 14.4 to 14.99, like 15 to 1, the converter will just shut down completely and it won't work at all. And many of the professional technicians have seen this in the past when they're monitoring O2 sensors. If they're comparing the front to the rear, they see that the rear is mirroring the front O2 sensor. It's operating just like the front. Then you know the converter is shut down and it stops working. And it could be because the air-fuel ratio is off significantly enough to make the converter shut down. Now, in order for the converter to work at high efficiency, it has to be within 0.5% of perfect lambda. So that lambda ratio is basically lambda of 0.995 to 1.005. That's peak efficiency. Anything outside that range, you're going to receive a P420, P430 code. So we need to make sure that lambda is perfect. Now, how can you do that as a technician? Well, I like to emphasize the use of a good 4 or 5 gas analyzer, because a 4 or 5 gas analyzer, it's going to instantly tell you what the air-fuel ratio is. It's going to tell you what lambda is, and you'll know if you're inside of that perfect efficiency range for the converter of 0.995 to 1.005. You know if you're too lean or too rich instantly by looking at the 5 gas. Plus, it also gives you other clues as to how many hydrocarbons are entering the exhaust stream. It'll tell you how much CO you have and how much NOx. So that'll also affect the converter efficiency, because efficiency is based on how hard the converter is working. So if you ask it to do a lot of work, if you're introducing a lot of emissions into the exhaust, the converter gets harder and its efficiency drops. If the converter is asked to just handle a few emissions, which it normally, if the engine's running good, it's only going to clean up a few remnants of the combustion process. So if it's only asked to do a little bit of work, its efficiency is going to be higher. So one way is with a good 4 or 5 gas analyzer. But if you don't have that tool, there's other ways you can look at fuel control. And so one of the strategies for the PCM uses to monitor fuel control is it looks at both the front O2 sensor and the rear O2 sensor. What is looking for is on the front O2 sensor, of course, it should be either air ratio or air fuel ratio sensor. It should, if it's an O2 sensor, it should be basically swinging back and forth around 450 millivolts. So 450 millivolts is perfect lambda of 1, or 14.7 to 1 air fuel ratio. And if you have good frequency and range on that O2 sensor, it feels that the engine is in good fuel control. But in modern vehicles, the PCM is also looking at the rear O2 sensor, some fuel trimming. So they use that to do some, not fuel control, but some trimming. And what it's looking for is readings above 450 millivolts. Readings above 450 millivolts usually indicates a rich condition, and that's really what you should see after the converter, because the converter's job is to store extra oxygen and release it to the unburnt hydrocarbons to form CO2 and water. So if the converter isn't able to handle or store all of the extra oxygen, then some of it will get past further and go to the rear O2 sensor. And so the PCM says, hey, we're too lean, we've got too much oxygen in the exhaust, I'm going to trim a little bit richer. And it's going to try to get to somewhere around 650 to 850 millivolts is pretty typical on most modern vehicles if the converter is working efficiently and the emissions out of the engine are where they should be. So I know that's a lot to digest, but really critical to not only converter operation and efficiency, but also engine efficiency, because as you add more fuel to the engine, of course, your fuel economy goes down, and everyone today is concerned with fuel economy, because of the price of gas. And of course, we're all concerned about emissions because, I can't overemphasize how important the professional technician job is as far as lowering emissions, because we're all breathing this air and it's really critical to our health. So we need to make sure that the converter's working properly, and ensuring that we have that proper feed gases is really critical to that. So that's step number 3 is checking for proper control, making sure you have that lambda of 1, that perfect balance, and that helps the engine work efficiently and the converter work efficiently. So the next step number 4, is to check for causes of converter contamination, or really just to see why the converter failed. So what I like to see professional technicians do is anytime you install a converter, let's pressure check the cooling system. And on a lot of modern vehicles, we're seeing contamination or poisoning of the converter due to coolant entering the combustion chamber. If you have an intake leak, or if you have a head gasket leak, the coolant is entering the combustion chamber, and of course it's going to go from there into the exhaust stream. Coolant is going to contaminate the converter, and basically it's going to coat the precious metals so that they can't interact with the harmful gases and help to convert those into CO2. So what I recommend is you simply do a pressure check of the cooling system. You rise the cooling system to whatever the cap pressure, so normally you're going to have anywhere from 13 to 18 psi in the cap. So you'll pressurize the cooling system to that pressure, and it should hold that pressure for a minimum of 15 minutes. If the pressure drops at all in 15 minutes, you have a leak somewhere. If there's not coolant leaking onto the floor, then you have an internal leak that you need to locate. And so I'm sure a lot of professional technicians out there have intake jobs on modern vehicles, have done gasket work. That all kind of ties into things that can damage the converter. Now, there are other things that can cause converter contamination. If the vehicle is using excessive oil, of course, oil can contaminate the converter and cause it to fail. And that was really predominant on older vehicles. I think newer vehicles, they can go much longer, and oil is a lot better than it used to be years ago. And so we're seeing less wear on critical engine parts, which are causing oil consumption. But it is another thing to look for. It's not as prevalent, though, as coolant leaks on modern vehicles. Mm-hmm. So, and then other causes of converter failure, of course, we want to check for those. The first thing I tell techs is take a look at that converter. Is the shell a bright bronze or bright blue? That the converter has reached a very high temperature and it's probably melted down internally. Now, Pete, it may come to as a surprise to many of the professional technicians that excessive fuel really doesn't cause a converter to melt. Excessive fuel can carbon it up and cause it to not work as efficiently, but whenever a converter melts, it's because there are misfires, cylinders misfiring, and that is basically allowing the air and the fuel to enter the exhaust stream at a much larger scale than normally would enter the exhaust. So let's say, for example, so as I mentioned before, the converter will shut down if the mixture is too rich, right?
Right.
It'll shut down if it's too lean, or the converter will shut down if the mixture is too lean. So if you don't have the perfect mixture, if you have too rich of a mixture, you're not going to melt the converter. But if you have a misfire, let's say you have a spark plug that's not firing, or a bad coil pack or ignition wire, then you're going to have the air and fuel enter the cylinder at that perfect balance of lambda of 1, and it's not going to spark, and all that air and fuel is going to enter the exhaust, and the converter is basically going to work overtime to try to convert all that air and fuel into CO2 water. And the byproduct is heat, so heat is created during that process, and so much heat can be created by the converter that it can actually melt down. And so normally a converter is going to operate, the substrate is going to operate at a relatively low temperature compared to the melting temperature. So normally I would expect a converter to light off around 350 or 450 degrees Fahrenheit. It may operate somewhere between 450 and 850 degrees Fahrenheit. It might even peak to 1200 degrees under adverse conditions. But when a converter melts down, it reaches temperatures pretty close to 2400 or 2600 degrees Fahrenheit, almost, the highest point of the normal range. So that means the converter really works much harder than it should due to misfires. And so if you have a converter that's melted, if you have that shell, that blue color, discolored shell, I would definitely check for minor misfires. Now, a lot of techs will say, well, hey, warn me if there's misfires, but there's an allowance there, and if you monitor misfires on a scan tool, you'll see that some cylinders may have 6, 8, 10, 12, as many as 20 misfires before you have a code log or before the mill light comes on. So we need to make sure that you have really zero misfires to last, because it's a cumulative thing. As the engine misfires, it's going to make the converter work harder, its efficiency will drop, and there's going to be an issue. So step 4 is to not only check for causes of converter contamination like coolant poisoning, but also determine what the root cause of the failure is and correct that. And then that leads to step number 5. Step number 5, basically, make sure you're installing the correct converters. We have a application out on walkerexhaust.com where you can look up the correct application for your vehicle. But some of the key things that I would mention is sure that you're looking at the emissions information label that's located underneath the hood of the engine compartment before you try to identify which converter is correct, because that label is going to give you a couple of key points of information. And the two main things I'm looking for is whether or not the vehicle is California certified, and it may say 50 state certified. There's other Q's there, or CARB certified, but we're looking for that, or you need to know if it's just federally certified. And then the other thing that's really important is EF, which is the engine family code number. That is a series of numbers that are listed on that tag, and we reference that in our catalog. And so to make sure you have the right converter for that engine family. And the engine family really relies on a lot of different things, even the vehicle GVW is tied into that. So you can have two engines that are identical, both 3 liters in the same vehicle, let's say a Ford Taurus, but they could have totally different engine family codes, depending on, the trim levels, depending on the GVW, depending on other options for the vehicle. You need to make sure that's correct. So that's it. That's like all 5 steps. I don't know if you have any questions pertaining to any of those, or if any of that seems like new information to you. But, hopefully that helps our technicians out.
Oh, I appreciate it, Joe, and I'm sure that the technicians have gained quite a bit, as I have, from listening to these 5 different steps. Again, just kind of synopsize for the guys and gals who are watching. Yes, you might have a problem with the catalytic converter. Look for that visual signs of overheating that may have caused the premature death of the converter. Make sure there's no exhaust leaks. Make sure there's no PCM-related trouble codes, emissions-related codes. Make sure there's no evidence of contamination. You're saying that coolant is found more often than people might think, right, in causing problems. Bottom line is, there are other outside issues that may cause these codes to set while the converter itself is just fine and dandy. Check these first. If you do determine the converter itself is bad, it's just as critical to know why it went bad. Now, we try to provide a lot of information in a relatively short period of time. Joe, for those who are watching, if they want more resources, training on this topic, where can they go? What resources does Walker bring to them?
Thanks for mentioning that, Pete. Yeah, that's really important. We have several avenues that they can use for gaining additional information on this, and there is a lot more to it as far as lowering emissions that I didn't go into. But for more detail, you can visit the Walker Exhaust website, where we have quite a bit of training material out there. We've also put together a number of videos on our YouTube channel, which is the Tentacle Inc. channel. Certainly they can call our technical assistance call centers. We have ASC certified technicians manning the phone lines, waiting to answer their call and help them out with those difficult emissions issues. These guys are really trained and knowledgeable in the things that you need to look at to lower emissions. Now, I've mentioned quite a few, but there are a number of other things, and I just want to touch on something I didn't mention before. A lot of modern vehicles use mass airflow sensors to monitor the amount of air going into the engine, and the PCM basically takes that amount of air and divides it by 14.7 to determine how much fuel needs to be injected in the engine. So they can talk about ways to make sure the mass airflow sensor is checked and you have good connection between that and the engine, a good seal. and to help lower emissions. And there's just a number of other things. They can help you out with cylinder balance issues, which can create, one lean cylinder can create 3 rich cylinders on a 4-cylinder engine. So if you have one lean sensor, the O2 sensor is sensing that, hey, there's extra oxygen entering the exhaust. It's going to richen the mixture for everything on that bank. So what you'll end up with is one slightly lean cylinder and a couple cylinders that are rich. So that really plays havoc on emissions, and our techs will help you identify, by looking at burn lines and ignition and whatnot, that can help you identify lean cylinders and cylinder balance issues. So they're really, I can't overemphasize, they're really a critical asset to helping the technician resolve their emissions control issues. And then another thing that we do, and the final thing that we do, is we hold emission diagnostic workshops in the evenings for these technicians. And so if a technician wants more detailed information on what I've just discussed over the last few minutes, they can attend a 3.5 or 4-hour training session that's held locally in their area. And so more information on that, all they need to do is contact their local Walker distributor, and they can fill them in on when we're going to have that diagnostic workshop in their area.
Awesome. Well, again, Joe, I can't thank you enough for taking the time. I know there's a lot of background obstacles that we had to overcome to make this happen. But again, I think it's going to be worth it for everyone who's watching. A lot of great information. Thank you so much for sharing that with the Motor Age audience.
You're welcome, Pete.